Well, good morning. Wonderful to be with you again this morning. If you do have your Bibles with you, I'm going to ask you to just turn with me now in the meantime to our passage for this morning. We're continuing in the book of 2 Corinthians, and you can turn to 2 Corinthians chapter 8, and then maybe just keep your finger in there. We're going to come and have a look at that passage in a minute. As my dad was mentioning this past week, we've been having our weekly prayer meetings on Zoom, and I'm sure that you've seen notices go out. We've just been asking you to pray, and I trust that you did take that opportunity. It was a wonderful chance for us to be united as a church in our prayer. And as he mentioned, obviously the reason that we have called the church together for this prayer is to address this one topic of money, and specifically the finances in the church. And we have seen, it's actually been over a number of months, but we have seen that the church's finances have, for lack of a better term, taken a hit. And I think really what this means is that we have set a budget that we believe is necessary to run the church on a monthly basis. And then we have seen how we have failed to meet the necessary income to fulfill that budget. And this means that obviously over the past few months we have been spending far more than we've been receiving. And it's a little bit difficult to kind of know how to respond to this, because I think the thing that we wanted to emphasize is that this is not crisis. It's not crisis. We have had a weekly, or a call to weekly prayer on this matter, but this is not crisis. In fact, I wouldn't even say that this is a problem. I think when we look at it from the outset, we may think, well, the most fundamental, basic accounting will tell you that there's an issue here. When you are spending more than you're receiving, and there's no real way of knowing that that income is going to come in. If you went into any business that was operating in this way, you'd be somewhat concerned, and I would say you probably would not invest in that business, and I'd say you'd be wise. You'd be wise to do that. As a church, though, we don't necessarily see this as a problem. It's definitely a factor. It's definitely something that we are aware of, and I think when we see it moving in this sort of direction in the rapid way that it has, it's something that we need to address, and we need to be aware of. But I do want to be careful to say that it doesn't necessarily mean that we have a problem. And the reason for that is that despite the way that we operate, our income as a church is completely planned. It's completely planned. It's determined before we receive it. And it's been determined for a long time. The amount of money that we receive every single month is very carefully specified. The only problem is it's not specified or determined by us. It is specified and determined by God. And so we operate in a way that basically comes to this topic as going, this is the Lord's ministry that utilizes the Lord's money, and so the Lord will provide as He sees fit. And we have to take that approach. We have to. As my dad said, over the past 40-odd years, that's the way we've done it. And over the past 40-odd years, we've seen challenges, we've seen difficulties. We are not a church that has ever been rich. And I thank the Lord for that. I really do thank the Lord for that. I can guarantee that there would be far greater problems, and those are actual problems, if we were a church that had been rich or that was rich. One of the ways that the Lord does provide, though, is that He instructs His church. He instructs His people. And He gives that instruction in His Word. And so that's why when we come to this situation, we don't really look at it as a problem that we need to solve. It can be so tempting to say, okay, what do we do? Let's sell off a portion of the property. Or let's open our gates to some sort of fundraising. Let's start renting out our buildings to something that's going to bring in a steady income. It can be so tempting to do that. And I think it's good that we have not done that. What we have done is quite simple, and I think many people, outsiders and non-believers, would look at it and kind of be perplexed by it. But what we've done is simply just run it upstairs to the boss, and he'll handle it. That's what we've done. We've approached this with prayer. Now, as the Lord does address this in His Word, it's something that we as a church have to address. And this has not been planned. It almost seems unnerving that we get to this passage at this time in 2 Corinthians on this very week. Not something that we have planned, but again, it is something that has been planned. Money is possibly the most sensitive subject that we can touch on in the church today. It is. We're aware of that. We understand that for many people, talking about money is very, very difficult. And discussing money causes tension, and it causes conflict and frustration and concern, possibly a bit of awkwardness. And it's weird because there's no real element of money that doesn't do this. We sometimes feel sensitive and awkward when we talk about having money. And the same token, we feel sensitive and awkward when we talk about not having money. And I know that particularly when I discuss this with my wife, and I'm sure you feel the same in some of your marriages, it's difficult and awkward to talk about spending the money. When I go to and I say we need to spend money, at the same time it's also difficult and awkward to go to and say we mustn't spend money. Money as a topic is a challenge. And I'll tell you, it's a little bit awkward to talk about it from up here. It is. How do we do this? I'm very aware that I've stood up here many times, and I'm glad that I have, and I will continue to do it, but I've stood up here many times, and I've spoken very strongly against those many churches that you'll find that promote wealth. There's many churches that will stand in front of you and say, you need to give and you will be rich. The prosperity gospel, in my view, is the biggest danger that the church faces today. And so it's awkward to stand up here and say, okay, now we get to this passage that does talk about money. How do I address it? But we're going to address it. We are. And we're not just going to address it this morning. It's a passage that is covered in chapter 8 and chapter 9 of 2 Corinthians. So it's a topic that we're going to talk about for possibly 3 or 4 weeks, maybe even 5 weeks as we discuss this. But the reality is we are preaching through 2 Corinthians. We've got into this passage of 2 Corinthians chapter 8, and Paul is addressing the topic of money. And so I have the privilege this morning of introducing this topic. And let's just have a look at the way that Paul does do that, or the way that he does introduce it and address it. 2 Corinthians chapter 8, and I'm going to read from verse 1 all the way down to the end of verse 7. And it says this: And now, brothers and sisters, we want you to know about the grace that God has given the Macedonian churches. In the midst of a very severe trial, their overflowing joy and their extreme poverty welled up in rich generosity. For I testify that they gave as much as they were able, and even beyond their ability, entirely on their own. They urgently pleaded with us for the privilege of sharing in this service to the Lord's people. And they exceeded our expectations. They gave themselves first of all to the Lord, and then by the will of God also to us. So we urged Titus, just as he had earlier made a beginning, to bring also to the completion this act of grace on your part. But since you excel in everything, in faith, in speech, in knowledge, in complete earnestness, and in the love you have, or in the love we have kindled in you, see that you also excel in this grace of giving. Some context just to understand what Paul is addressing here. As Paul has been traveling around and he's been conducting ministry, he's been pastoring, he's been planting church, he has also been collecting finances to take back to the church in Jerusalem. And the Christians in Jerusalem were facing very, very severe persecution. Very severe persecution. Remember, at the time, Jerusalem was a Jewish city, and it was ruled by a Jewish order, and so thus the movement of anyone who was Jewish away from Judaism towards Christianity was something that was not accepted. And so these Christians who were in Jerusalem primarily Jews faced a huge amount of persecution that resulted in them being shunned. They were ostracized. Essentially, they were removed from their families. They were removed from the community. It became extremely difficult for them to do anything, let alone earn an income. I mean, we think of Stephen. We know the story of Stephen. Stephen was Jew. And Stephen became a Christian. He was saved because of his understanding that Jesus is the Christ. And what did the Jews do? They stoned him just outside the city. This is the same city that this church is living in. To be a Christian in Jerusalem was to face severe hardship. And so as Paul is going around, he's relaying this to the churches, and he's gathering an offering that he can take back to help them out in this hardship. And really, a lot of the churches that he was ministering to were partaking in this, and one of the churches was, in fact, this very church of Corinth. They had heard his teaching on what was happening back in Jerusalem, and they said, yes, we want to be a part of this. We want to give. But then, the church of Corinth had a falling out with Paul. And obviously there were those false teachers that came in, and they questioned who he was, and they questioned his authority, and they questioned his motives. And so what happened to the church is they went, well, maybe we've been a little bit foolish in trusting this Paul guy, and he's just trying to get our money, so they stopped. They stopped with their giving. That falling out is then mended, as we've seen. That relationship is restored, and so Paul addresses them again. He says, now that the relationship has been fixed, let's get back to this point of giving financially to those struggling in Jerusalem. And that's really what we have here in verse 6 and verse 7 of our passage. So the way that we're going to look at the passage this morning, we're going to kind of flip it over, and we're going to start at the end. We're going to look at verse 6 and 7. As I've just said, this is going to give us the context. We're going to jump back to verse 5, and then we're going to work from the start at verse 1. So verse 6 and 7 gives us that context. It says, so we urge Titus, just as he had earlier made a beginning. So in the start he had presented this idea of collecting the offering, to bring also to completion this act of grace on your part. You started it, now it's time to complete this act of grace, graciously giving in generosity. Since you excel in everything, in faith, in speech, in knowledge, in complete earnestness, and in love that we have kindled in you, see that you also excel in this grace of giving. Clearly, the Corinthian church, though they had their troubles, and their troubles were multiple, they have also displayed great strengths. Things like faith, things like speech, knowledge, love. And Paul looks at those things and he says, you've done really well in this. There's one area that I want you to also focus on. One area that is as important. And I like the fact that he's coupled it with these ideas, these great understandings that are so necessary to the Christian faith. Knowledge of God and His character, love for one another, speech, faith. Faith. By faith we are saved. Paul has coupled this in. He said there's another grace that you need to work on, and that is the grace of giving. And the way that he calls them to this is he uses an example of some of the other churches that he's been involved with. And they are the churches that are in the Macedonian region, churches like Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea, possibly a couple of other small churches as well. And Paul brings this example. He says, let me tell you about these churches and the way that they have displayed this grace of giving. And through that you can understand it. And the way that he does it is he presents a number of principles that the Corinthian church needs to take into account. And then the same principles that I'm going to present this morning. Principles that need to be understood and exercised by the believers when they partake in giving. So I'm going to give these to you. There are 5 of them. They're all contained in verse 1 to 5. I'm going to start in verse 5, then I'm going to jump back to verse 1. Now firstly, before I say that, I just want to make this statement. Money is a very specific subject with regards to this passage, with regards to this chapter, and with regards to chapter 9. Money is also a very specific topic, a very specific item that is being dealt with contextually in Paul's instruction and his address to the Corinthian church. But I want to say that money is not actually the issue that Paul is addressing in this passage today. It's not actually money. Money is there, and money is definitely a topic, but money is not the issue. The issue that Paul is addressing is one of generosity and giving. And while there's definitely an overlap, and we can see that, they are not necessarily the same thing. I'm going to explain why in a minute when we look at this first principle that we see from the Macedonian church. So, we have it here in verse 5. The first thing that we see from the Macedonian churches is that they gave themselves first unto the Lord. That's what we see in verse 5. In other words, money was simply the expression of their devotion. Their primary desire, their primary focus was to devote themselves to the Lord. And because that's primary, that's why I want to address it first. That's why I've jumped all the way down to verse 5 to start there. It is essential that that is the starting point. That was the starting point for the Macedonians. It's essential that's the starting point for us today. It's the expression that we see in Romans chapter 12, verse 1. That verse that we know, that we love, that we're not really sure how to understand it all the time. Romans 12 verse 1, therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. What does it mean to offer our bodies as a living sacrifice? How do we sacrificially offer ourselves up? Well, this is what the Macedonians were doing. They were prioritizing generosity, they were prioritizing giving, but only as an expression of them obeying what they see in Romans chapter 12 verse 1, giving themselves up, devoting themselves over to the Lord. They recognized that offering themselves to God was the essential calling and purpose of their lives. And just understand what this means. They looked at everything in their lives. They looked at their families, they looked at their jobs, they looked at their possessions, they looked at their hobbies, they even looked at their own reputations, and they determined that none of these things was as essential or should take preference to their devotion to God. And this shouldn't be a shocking thing to us, because what they did is they just followed Christ's calling to all believers. That's what Christianity is. That's why Christianity is a devotion, because we understand that this is our chief end. There are many things in our life that are certainly important, but we have to understand that this is the primary one. That's why the instruction in this passage is not primarily about money. It's about devotion to the Lord. The expression of that devotion is generosity and giving, and in this context, as Paul is taking a financial offering, Macedonian churches were giving finances. And if this passage was about money, then we as a church would have a very big problem. And I think that there are some churches that do have this problem, and one day they're going to be in trouble because they have no way of resolving it. The problem that we would have is that anyone who is rich and anyone who has much money to spare would be able to be obedient to God's instruction. Contrarily, anyone who is not rich or does not have a lot of money to spare would find it very difficult to be obedient to God's instruction. And worse than that, anyone who has nothing financially, and we live in South Africa, and we know that this is a very hard and real reality for many, many people. Those that have nothing would essentially be doomed because they could never be obedient to the Lord. How do these churches that call upon money resolve this problem? Because what they're essentially saying is, your obedience, your way of pleasing God, is for sale. That's what's happening in the church today. This is primarily the main thing that set Martin Luther off with the Protestant Reformation, was that the Catholic Church was doing something very similar. They were essentially selling a means to salvation, selling a means to pleasing God. And that's happening today in 2025 in churches dotted all around us and all around the world. It's a very dangerous and very worrying thing. We look at Mark chapter 12, verse 41. And we know the story. It's a wonderful story. I'm going to read it. Jesus sat down opposite the place where the offerings were put and watched the crowd putting their money into the temple treasury. Many rich people threw in large amounts, but a poor widow came and put in 2 very small copper coins worth only a few cents. Calling his disciples to him, Jesus said, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others. They all gave out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in everything, all she had to live on." Now, this is not a call to embrace poverty. This is not Jesus saying, you've got to get rid of everything. That's not what he's saying here. It's not a call to abandon a monetary system. What this is a call to devotion. Jesus commended this woman because of her devotion. And it was a devotion to the Lord and not to her own means of provision. Because it was a matter of devotion, the financial value was irrelevant. It's irrelevant. And let me tell you that the financial value of the church across this world is pretty irrelevant to the Lord. It's pretty irrelevant. His ministry is not dependent on how much money is out there. It's not dependent on how much money is in churches. It's not. It's a factor that we have to live with in this world. But the value is not very relevant to him. Likewise, the Macedonians, they understood this principle. They gave because of their devotion. The second principle that we see from the Macedonian church is they gave in response to God's grace. And this is now when we jump back to verse 1. Verse 1 says, "And now, brothers and sisters, we want you to know about the grace that God has given the Macedonian churches." Grace is the most wonderful thing in this world. It's the most wonderful thing in this world. And the grace of God to save us is the very reason that we are sitting here gathered today. We don't have to be here. Many of us only get 2 days off a week. Why are we spending one of them sitting in a room together? It's because we understand that God saved us through His grace. And the thing which makes grace so incredible, the reason that we can respond in this way, is because that grace that we have was freely given to us. Freely given to us. We all know John 3 verse 16, and what does it tell us? For God so loved the world that He gave His only Son. We didn't have to earn it. It was given freely to us. Giving, and giving generously, is an act that we learn firstly from God. God gave us salvation, and He gave us eternal life and redemption. He gave us forgiveness from sin. He gave us the freedom from sin. He gives us so much more, and we need to be aware of that. He gave us the life that we all have, the life that we received this very morning. And He gives us the oxygen that we breathe this very minute in this hall, and He gives us the ability for our bodies to pump blood around our body this very second. All of that we have only because God has given it to us. We need to understand that. If there is anything good and worthy that we have in this world, we have it because God gave it. Therefore, if there are things that we need to give, we have to recognize that we can give them back freely. Why? Because they weren't really ours to begin with. They were given to us first. And so, as it was given out of grace from God, just as the Macedonians did, we give. The third principle that we see from the Macedonian church They gave beyond their ability. This comes to us from verse 2. It says, in the midst of a very severe trial, their overflowing joy and their extreme poverty welled up in rich generosity. For I testify that they gave as much as they were able, and even beyond their ability. Even as the churches in Macedonia were giving to the very needy people in Jerusalem, they too were facing severe difficulty. This was not simply a matter of some very, very wealthy churches giving a portion of their finances to very unwealthy churches or poor churches. It's not a matter of churches that are free from persecution giving over to those that are being persecuted. The Macedonian churches were facing this too. They themselves had financial struggle. Paul says here that they faced extreme poverty. It was a difficult situation for them. Macedonia is a region of the Roman Empire at this time. The Roman Empire was very, very strict and very, very harsh in the way that it dealt with its subjects, particularly Christians. There was a lot of persecution, and so these churches are feeling that. Yet they gave generously. Paul points out that they gave beyond their ability. Now, I spent a bit of time on really thinking, what does this mean? They gave beyond their ability. And I don't think that we must look at this and interpret it as saying something along the lines of, to follow the Macedonian example, we all need to go out and max out our credit cards, take out as much debt as possible so that we can take that money and give it, however we give it. I don't think that that's really what it's saying. Number one, that's not a biblical principle, living in debt, firstly. And number two, I think that we can also look at things quite logically and say, that's quite a dumb thing to do. It's quite a dumb thing to do. You're going to cause a lot of damage in that way. So I don't think that that's what we must see here. Rather, I think that what Paul is saying, as we look at the Macedonians, is that their giving took them to a point that may have left them somewhat uncomfortable, in somewhat of a pinch. I've got a quote here on the second page of the bulletin from C.S. Lewis that I thought was very appropriate. This comes out of Mere Christianity, which is basically C.S. Lewis's instruction to believers. What is Christianity? He says, on addressing this matter of giving, I do not believe one can settle how much we ought to give. I am afraid the only safe rule is to give more than we can spare. And I think that that's a good understanding of what Paul is addressing here, what Paul sees with the Macedonian church. Give more than we can spare. Many of them would have recognized that giving was going to cause them to feel that pinch, yet they did it anyway. And I think there's a nice principle here. It's something that my dad shared with me this week that I think is true. If we do not give when we have little, it's highly unlikely that we will give when we have lots. And that doesn't seem right, because I think we approach this and go, well, I don't really have much now, so let me just wait. And when I have a lot of money, then I'll make sure I take a big lump sum. And it doesn't really work that way. And I think we know that. I think if we've ever been in trouble with the tax man, we know that as well. It's easy to think, well, I'll just struggle for now and I won't really pay my taxes. But at the end of the year, when I get my bonus, I'll make sure that I pay it off. What happens come around to February? Didn't really do that. And I think that's because giving is a pattern that we actually develop in our life. It has to be. It's an expression. It's not just an act. If we do not give when we have little, it's highly unlikely that we will give when we have much. That's the third principle. The fourth principle that we see from the Macedonian church, they gave entirely on their own. Macedonian church, they gave willingly and not because they were instructed to, rather because they had personally decided to. Now, we look at this, and it does seem that there might be a little bit of a contradiction here, because Paul has addressed this to the Corinthian church. It seems hard for him to say, I want you to give without prompting, but in writing this to you, I'm prompting you to give. And it may seem a little bit contradictory for me to stand up here and say, well, that's my point, give entirely of your own without prompting, but by standing up here and preaching that point to you, am I not prompting you to give? Well, I think what Paul is drawing out of the Macedonian example here is that once again, their giving came from their hearts and not out of compulsion. And I think that this is absolutely crucial. We have to understand it. Giving out of compulsion is not really giving. It's not really giving. The point that Paul is making in addressing the Corinthian church is that they should give, once again, as we saw on the first point, as an expression of devotion. And so this means that giving for any other reason, whether it's peer pressure, whether it's to make yourself feel good, whether it's to create a reputation amongst others, whether it's simply religiosity. Well, I'm a part of the church, that's what we do, so I do it. Whether it's tax incentives, any reason to give other than out of the devotion of your heart, particularly if it's because someone has told you to do it, failing to meet the mark of generosity and giving. Failing to meet that mark. And so I looked at that verse and it gave me a little bit of encouragement, knowing that I have to stand here and preach about this, because really what I'm doing is I'm just relaying a message. I'm not standing here and telling you need to give. I'm not. Please understand that I really am not. I'm simply relaying what Paul has given us already. I feel a little bit encouraged by that. When we give, it is between us and the Lord. Completely. And at the church, we recognize that and we try and put measures in place to keep to that. We don't keep a record of who's giving. Very often we don't know who's giving. And that's the way that we want it. That's the way that it should be. It's between you and the Lord, and it needs to be done entirely out of your own will. We know the principle that the Lord loves a cheerful giver. When we give cheerfully, not begrudgingly. And if it is begrudgingly that we give, don't give. Don't give. You're wasting money. That's the fourth principle. The final principle that we see from the Macedonian church. Give as a privilege. This comes to us from verse 4. It says, they urgently pleaded with us for the privilege of sharing in this service to the Lord's people. Giving is not an investment. It's not an investment. It's not a payment. And it's not even a means to solving a problem. And I do want to say that this morning. It's not a means to solving a problem. If we think, well, look, if we can just get the right amount of people to give this morning, it can solve our financial problems for the rest of the month. We're fooling ourselves. And we know that because we just had a break-in a few months ago that told us that it doesn't matter what you have. Just like that, you can wake up one morning and it's gone. And so we're thinking, well, let's just push through this week, hope that people give, now we're sorted. We're misunderstanding giving. Giving is not a means to solving a problem. Giving is a privilege. It's a privilege. It's a privilege because it allows us to partake in the Lord's ministry, particularly, as it says here in our passage, as a service to the Lord's people. Isn't that a radical idea? Giving is a privilege. It's exactly how the Macedonians saw it. It's exactly how Paul instructs the Corinthians to approach it. I don't know if you can ever remember offhand a situation that you might have found yourself in where you were completely helpless in any sort of degree. Possibly it was something quite serious. You're standing around in a medical situation, something's going on, and you're just completely helpless. You don't know what to do. Maybe you're standing around and you're watching that fuel fall out of the bottom of your car, and you think, what on earth do I do here? I don't know what to do. Or what approach can I take? I felt it quite a few times in the last couple of weeks. You're holding a new baby, and he's screaming in your face, and you don't know what to do. And I wish I did. We've spoken about this. I wish I could say, okay, he needs food. No, he's eaten. He doesn't need food. Okay, he saw. No, he's not. He's got a... And you just stand there and you go, I don't know what to do. I honestly have no idea what to do. I'm helpless in this situation. And I realize that when you're standing there, you're not going, okay, what I really want to do is put the baby down, preferably downstairs in the laundry, far away from us, and just leave the problem to solve itself. That's not really what we hope for. What we hope for is, I wish there was a way that I could have an impact on the situation. That's what we hope for. And when our car isn't running because it's shooting all this oil out and we don't know how to fix it, we don't think, oh, well, it's fine, I wish there was another car I could drive. We think, I wish there was a way that I could be helpful in solving this problem or in contributing to the situation. That's what giving is. I'm not sure if you felt this in other instances, but this is an opportunity for us to be involved. It's an opportunity for us to contribute. It's an opportunity for us to look at the Lord and say, Lord, you are doing ministry in this world and you are engaging with your people. And I don't want to stand by helplessly. I want to be involved. One of the ways that we can be involved is we can give. We can give. That's the very point that Paul is addressing here. Giving is a God-given privilege, and that allows us to contribute to His ministry. Now I want you to just hold on to that for a second, because I'm going to come back and I just want to talk a little bit about that. But I want to preface and say that I've been a part of this church for many years, my entire life, and genuinely my entire life. I've been an official member in this church for 17 years, but I was born down the road, and I'm pretty sure that I'm pretty sure that you preached a sermon in this church on the day that I was born. I think you did. In fact, I know you did because my mom told me. But she said, make sure that I don't do that when I was born. But I was born in this church. I've been in this church my entire life. I have genuinely had the privilege of seeing the generosity of this church. I have. And I've seen it for many, many years. I've been blown away to see the generosity of this church in the past year. We have suffered a financial loss in that robbery to the tune of 100,000 rand. It was written off, not by insurance, but by people's generosity. And it's blown me away. It has. I know that there are people sitting here today. I don't know who you are and I don't know the circumstances, but I know that there are people sitting here today that have been so generous in incredible ways that we will never even know about. I'm aware of that. And I want to say thank you for that. Truly, thank you for that. More than that, I want to encourage you and let you know that your giving does not go unnoticed. It doesn't. Very possible that no one in this church is going to see it. It's very possible that no one in this world is going to see it. But the Lord knows. He knows, and He does see your generosity. It's something which pleases Him greatly. Please know that. Please understand that. Please hold on to that. And so as I mentioned, that one of the ways that we can contribute to God's ministry is by giving. I also want to say that this passage does speak specifically about financial giving. And the context of these next two chapters in 2 Corinthians do speak specifically about financial matters. But the biblical principle of this passage is about generosity and giving. And the principle does not necessarily only mean financial giving. And this is another reason that this passage is not about money. Because giving is not solely about money. There are other ways that we can give to. And while they are not the things that Paul is addressing here, the principle does address them. And there are many ways that we can be generous. We can be generous with our time. I think that's a massive one. Sometimes that might even be a bigger matter than finances. It may be something that is more valuable than finances. But giving generously of your time, giving generously of your commitments to pray, giving generously of your commitment in ministry, to be obedient. Maybe the Lord has given us an instruction that is extremely difficult. And you think, I don't want to do that. That's hard. But we can give our obedience to the Lord and to one another. We can give in the way that we teach and we mentor and we minister. We can give of our skills and talents. There are talents and skills in this church that I'm sure many of us don't even know about. There are abilities that people have in this church that we wish we could have access to. What an opportunity as a community to give ourselves and give those skills over to one another. Wonderful opportunity. We can give of our service. We can give in grace and forgiveness. It's a massive one. If we have received grace, we have received forgiveness, how much too should we be giving that? We can give of our hospitality and our comfort. This is one that terrifies me. It terrifies me, the thought of placing myself in a situation where I could potentially be uncomfortable and having someone over to my house where I don't really want to have this person here. But it may be an opportunity to be hospitable. It may be an opportunity to be loving. It may be an opportunity to have impact in that person's life. We can give. The list goes on. There are so many different ways that we can give. I think the important thing is that when we do give, we do it according to the principles that have been laid out this morning in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 1 to 7. I'm going to read through them again. Number 1, when you give first unto the Lord. Number 2, give in response to God's grace. Number 3, give beyond our ability. Number 4, give entirely on our own and of our own conviction and decision. And number 5, give as a privilege. As I said, there'll be a number of sermons on this topic. Many to come in the next couple of weeks. So if you are sitting here thinking, whoa, he missed a whole lot of very important information on finances, please rest assured that is coming. And I would even encourage you over the week, just read through these 2 chapters and use them as an opportunity to prepare your heart. These things come and they're difficult and they're hard to wrestle with and they're convicting. But they're God's word and they're God's instruction. And we have a duty not only to preach them and to share them with one another, but to be obedient to them. I trust that this morning you might be encouraged by that. I trust that this morning you might look at the way that you have been generous, the way that you have given, and find hope in the fact that God is pleased with it. I trust too that the Lord will convict you daily, as He convicts all of us, that our devotion is to Him, and if our devotion is taken in any matter to anything else, whether it be time, or whether it be convenience, or whether it be comfort, or whether it be money, I pray that we will be convicted of that this week. Okay? Let's pray. Lord, we thank you primarily for yourself. And we thank you for your grace in saving us and in giving us life daily. May we go through this life knowing that whatever we have is from you, freely given. And we thank you that it's freely given because we could never afford it. We could never earn it. I pray that that will filter over into the way that we give and the way that we are generous to others in a number of different ways. I pray that you would convict us, that you would leave us restless if there are matters that we need to be convicted on. I pray that you would draw us to yourself in this matter, and that through this we may come to know you in a way that we have never seen before, a way that is mind-blowing, in the way that we know your generosity, your provision, and your love. Lord, I thank you for this church. I thank you for the fact that you are committed and loyal and faithful to this church. And I thank you that you will provide as you see fit. I pray that we'll rest on that. We'll rest on that and have faith to come to you and leave this matter at your feet. I pray all this in your great and your holy name.